In our final video of this series, we're going to take a look at functions that are calling other functions. We've kind of seen this a little bit, but we haven't taken a look at the hierarchy in depth. So we're going to create a few functions that perform small tasks, and they're going to be called in series by one main function. We're going to use the example of the Mario game because I think it's an excellent way to understand the function call hierarchy, and it's going to update the game state and perform small tasks within each function. So far we've seen functions that have void or non-void return types, and functions that take in parameters, and even functions with if statements. Now we're going to take a look at functions that call other functions for our final part of this series. So we're going to use a pretty fun example again of the Mario game, just because it's easily relatable, and I find it pretty easy to understand if you think of the big picture of the game. So we looked at the simple function that just performed the check. So that was just the if statement. If the Goomba position and Mario position are the same, then we basically lose a life. So let's follow that train of thought, and let's go ahead and create those variables again. So we had an int that was Mario position. I'm going to give this 5. And we had an int that was Goomba position. And let's give this 3 to start off with, and then we had lives. And let's start that off at 3. Okay, so we have our variables set up here. Now, let's create some kind of functions. I talked a little bit last video about the game state advancing. Well, that's going to be basically one big function. At least in the old games, like the old original Mario, that's how it worked. It was just basically one big advanced function that called a bunch of smaller functions to do tasks. So it would look something like this. So we'd have a public void, and let's call this advanced game. It's not going to take in any parameters, and it's going to be a void. And basically all it's going to do is it's going to call a bunch of functions. So we are going to basically just have this function calling everything. It's not really going to do anything except call the other functions. Okay, so we'll leave that blank. We'll create another one. So this is going to be another public void, and this is going to be advance Goomba. And this is going to change Goomba's position. So we have the Goomba position equals Goomba position plus 1. This is the excellent thing about having the global variables, just as a side note, is that we don't have to pass in parameters. Because if we didn't have this global variable, we would have to pass in a parameter to this function every single time we want to update Goomba's position. But because we have it global, then every function can have access to it. And not only to the variable, but to its value as well. Okay. So now this is just going to be advanced Goomba, and this is going to, we're next going to make another function that will perform the check to see if Goomba and Mario are touching. So this is the same one we saw as before. This shouldn't be an if. The if statement goes in the function. And this one was just check if touching. Okay, and here we go. We're just going to set that up, and then it was an if Mario position equals Goomba position. And last time we had a couple of parameters passed in, so we actually passed in the Goomba and the Mario positions themselves as parameters, but we don't actually need to do that now. That was just to demonstrate the if statement in the function with parameters, but again, because they're global variables, we don't need to, and in fact it's better that we don't. So if Mario position equals Goomba position, then we want to say lives equals lives minus 1. Okay, so that's good. And then now we're going to do another function call here in just a second, and I'm going to show you why. So we're going to create the final function. This is just going to be a small system, so just a few different activities going on here. We could make this big. We could design the whole game if we wanted to, but that would take a long time, and that's not what I'm here to do. So this is going to be a public void, and this is going to be check if alive. And this is basically going to say if lives is 0, then we're just going to have some kind of a message saying game over, such as in a real game it would be, we would have the actual game state end and we would have the entire game end. But for now we're just going to have, because we don't have that kind of advanced game, we're just going to have a message saying game over. Alright, so we've set our functions up. Now it's time to make some function calls. The first thing we want to do is to call our function in the equivalent of main. So this is our onCreate. So this is where all our function calls go. And we're going to say advanced game. And this one is going to, the advanced game function is going to call advanced Goomba. And it's also going to say check if touching. Alright, and now the check if touching is going to perform the check if alive. And I think it's an appropriate place for it because we want to check if alive after we do check if touching. Because we're updating the number of lives after we've basically done the check to see if they're touching or not. We could also put it right here if we wanted to. We could put it here just after check if touching, but I want to show you the example of helper functions. So this is going to be called in here. This advanced game function is going to be called in here, and that's going to call this function, and it's going to call check if touching, and check if touching is going to call check if alive. So this is an example of a series of the main function and then a series of what we call helper functions. So these are just going to be little functions that perform a single task, because that's kind of what we really want. We don't want one function performing a bunch of tasks. It's slow and it's messy and it's just bad practice in general. So generally we want these functions to just perform one or two small tasks, and then we can just create a ton of functions if we want just to perform these little tasks. And that's really what you'd generally see in big codes, just because it's a nice way to keep the functions and the rest of the code organized. Right, so here's our little system. We have the advanced game, and it's going to move Goomba, and it's going to check if they're now touching. And then we're also going to perform the check if alive. Okay, so if lives equals 0, we want this text, and then maybe let's have an else clause. And we'll say otherwise text.text equals maybe game is still running. If we want, I know it wouldn't really say that if we were actually playing the game, but I want something to print out. Okay, good stuff. Let's go ahead and see this in action. We're going to run it with an XSS again. So there's a lot of steps, and I know this can be a little confusing, but just follow the steps one at a time. So you can follow the function calls here. So we see advanced game, okay, so then we'll go to advanced game, see what's going on. We're going to do advanced Goomba, okay, we're going to see that's happening. We're also going to do check if touching, so we look at that, that's performing that check, and that's going to call check if alive, and that's going to perform this function. And because the positions are, Mario and Goomba positions aren't the same, it means they're not touching, the game is still running. Where if they are the same, and our lives is at 1, so the positions have been the same a couple of times already, we should have a game over. Game is still running if lives equals 0, so we get, I see, because the position is +1. So if we have the Goomba position to be 4, run again. And the reason that one didn't pass is because they were the same, but we did a advanced Goomba. There we go, game over. That's the result we wanted. And this is because, again, 4 and 5, so the advanced game called advanced Goomba, which changed Goomba's position to 5. And then we realize that they're touching, so we lose a life. We're only at 1 life already, so now our lives at 0. And because they are, we get this text being printed out. So this is a little scenario of functions calling other functions. I wanted to end this tutorial on a fun note. So think about next time you're playing any kind of a video game, think about how the function structure is set up, because you'll have a similar sort of thing. You'll have lots of little functions that are being called by the functions kind of higher up in the hierarchy. So again, anytime you're playing a game, keep that in mind. It's kind of a fun way to think of things. Otherwise, this has been our tutorial series on functions in Xamarin Studio. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time. In this final part of our function series, we had a little fun. So we looked at functions that called other functions. We did this by creating a part of a Mario game where there was a main function that called other little functions to update a game state. So we had the big advanced game state function, and it just basically didn't really do anything except call lots of other functions in one place. Then we had one that was updating the Goomba position, one that was checking to see if Goomba and Mario were touching, and another to see if we're alive. So great use of these functions just to perform these little checks and to perform, again, just one task at a time, because we don't want to create incredibly complex functions. So by now you should be able to create and understand slightly complex function hierarchies where we have 1 or 2 main functions calling lots of smaller helper functions that perform small tasks, rather than just jamming all the code into 1 or 2 functions. This has been our series on functions in Xamarin Studio. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next video.